going to introduce all three, and I think we'll just move on. Bruce, then Heather, then Mark. Okay. So Bruce Pascoe is a Boonwurrung Tasmanian Yuin man, an author of Dark Emu that many of you will have read, and some of you may have seen the Bangarra performance based on that book. Heather comes to us from Canada with expertise in peace and conflict studies, Thomas Berry, ecological feminism, and much else. And Mark Brett is a Hebrew Bible scholar with experience in native title law, and he is author of Political Trauma and Healing. I think that's the right title. Yes. Bruce and Heather will each present for around 20 minutes each, and Mark will respond for about 10 minutes, and we'll see where we're up to at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thank my brother David for the welcome to country, which is not just a form of words, but a welcome onto country, which asks us to acknowledge the country. I'd also like to acknowledge the people of country from before and now and in the future. And I'd like to thank all the participants in the conference for their gathering around a word such as peace. I was brought up and educated in various places, but I went to university here, and I was taught that war was the natural condition of man and that there was nothing you could do about it. All you could do was moderate it. Well, on this land, our people organised a society a very long time ago where everybody had a house, everybody had food, and everybody took part in the culture and participated equally in the culture, and when they were old, they were looked after by young, and it was forbidden to go to war for land. And we know that this is true in the Western view of truth because of our languages, which are so specific to time that we know that they've been placed in their locations over a long period of time. And I'm just going to walk and talk and get my PowerPoint.
Sorry about this. Technology.
So it's important for us to understand about our country, Australia, and the society which was displaced. And last night I was sent a photograph of a painting by my brother Jonathan Jones, who Jonathan's a young Wiradjuri man and has been doing enormous research in libraries and museums. And he sent me a painting of an Aboriginal village near the Coorong in South Australia. And we both had the same reaction to this painting of enormous sadness. The artist had painted it after the shipwreck of the Maria. The Maria went down near the Coorong. Aboriginal people rescued the people off the Maria, and they all began to walk back toward this village. And along the way, some dispute was found, and Aboriginal people killed non-Aboriginal people, and non-Aboriginal people killed Aboriginal people. And later on, 2 Aboriginal people were hung, which was something that Aboriginal people had never seen before. But the painting of this village, where the party were heading, has a legend underneath it by Frome, the explorer Frome, whose name now rests on the lake near Lake Eyre, Lake Frome. At the very bottom of the painting, Frome writes, "Burnt by me, October 20th." So he's burnt down this village. In the centre of the village, there's a building which is 8 times the size of any of the others. It's like a small town hall, built in the dome style of Aboriginal villages in the south of the country, and a beautiful location. It's in a valley floor in the midst of some ranges. It's an idyllic place, an idyllic village, and minutes after the painting was finished, it was burnt to the ground. The important thing about using words like village, because when I was working on Dark Emu, I was talking about Aboriginal foods, and I was conscious of words like harvest and tilling and storing and preparing, because these are all agricultural terms, and Europeans were applying these terms to Aboriginal agriculture. I apologise for there not being a PowerPoint at the moment.
It's there now, Bruce.
It's my fault, because I live so remotely that my internet relies on cat's whiskers and technology of that kind, and so I wasn't able to forward it because it wouldn't leave my place to get here, so that I didn't do this to Joe and give him a problem at the seminar. These are the eggs of the rainbow serpent on Mount Goongerah in Far East Gippsland. And the rainbow serpent is a creator spirit for Aboriginal people. It went everywhere. The rainbow serpent went everywhere and formed land as it went, and left stories for people. And these stories were about caring for country, truly caring for the country. And the importance of the next slide. Well, let me tell you about it. When I grew up in a Christian family, and there was an artist called Edward Hick who painted a lot of paintings which had legends running round the outside of the painting. And it was about, and it said, "And the lamb shall lie down with the leopard, and the kid with the lion, and they shall be led from the wilderness by a little child." There are countless versions of this, something like 80 to 100 versions of this painting, and they used to be common in Australia. I'm sure you've seen one or more of them. And what I didn't realise until a few years ago was that in that portion of the painting, there's William Penn, the Puritan, who is talking to some Aboriginal First Nation American Indians, and he had his arms out in the Christian expression of forgiveness and giving. You can see that the bridge in the background indicates that this is very post-colonial period, if there is such a thing. I think Australia is still in a colonial period. But the First Nation people have already been devastated by war, and then smallpox, which was deliberately introduced into blankets which were given to Indian people. by the Army, the British Army. Who did the same in Australia if the historians who have written those books on the introduction of smallpox in Australia are correct? And Penn is dealing with those First Nation people who are on their knees, and they say to him, you can have a block of land and it shall be formed by you walking from sunrise to sunset, and that'll form the side of a square of land that you can have from us. What William Penn then did, the man of Christian grace, is that he trained athletes to run in relay from dawn to dark. It's not a Christian act, and yet he called himself a Puritan. He tenfolded the amount of land he took from those people and probably destroyed forever the relationship between the people, who must have thought, well, if that's the work of Christ, then I will have nothing to do with such a man. And the image that I was looking at last night was very similar and had a similar effect on me, because I realised that the relationship and the attitude to land and other people was vastly different between the settler and Aboriginal people. I was talking to a group recently, and I could see this map up in the back of the hall. Same style, probably from the same era. And it says, breathes there a man with soul so dead who never to himself hath said, this is my own, my native land. It's a map of London. So the people of London are saying to themselves, we are nationalists, we love our land, and yet they are exactly the same people in exactly the same period who came to Australia, took the land and burnt down the village on the Coorong. Go to the next one, thanks Joe. Manalajanna, we have a Tasmanian heritage. About 70% of Aboriginal people are related to this man, for the simple reason that by the early 1800s there were very few men left. The war in Tasmania was brutal and prolonged, and there was much death. Eventually George Augustus Robinson was trying to make peace with Aboriginal people, but in a way that itself was a ruse. All of the remaining people were taken to the offshore islands. The deal was that when things settled down in mainland Tasmania, they'd go back. But in fact, that never happened. They all died on Flinders Island, and some of their relations form a substantial part of the Tasmanian Aboriginal population today. Manalajanna was wise to what was going on, and as the bow of the boat ground into the sand of that beach, he cut off all his dreadlocks and threw them into the sea. It was an act of absolute despair, and there's probably been very few more graphic acts of despair and dislocation. Thanks, Joe. I hope all Australian children learn about this photograph. It shows a stone which is in fact that big. It's at the Australian Museum and has never been exhibited, has thousands of other fellows alongside in the dungeons of Australian Museum, has never been exhibited to the public of Australia. And you have to ask yourself why? Why would Australia, having this stone, not exhibit it? Because that stone is too heavy to use as a hand tool. You can't keep it above your waist for too long. It has these hafting marks. So the handle for that stone was fixed at right angles to it. The stone was very heavy, could only be used in this fashion between the legs, and that's because it's a pick. It's a soil turning tool, a weeding tool. Jonathan Jones, once again, this young man who is so devoted to his people's cause that he does all this research, and he found by asking scientists to analyse that stone and its fellows that it had never been used on stone, never been used on wood, it had only ever been used in soil. It's an agricultural tool. We'll go to the next one. When Jonathan sent it to me, I wondered if there were any more. I was in Dalesford at the time. I went to the local museum and there was a stack of them in a glass case, and it had stones of unknown use, collected from Aboriginal people. Why? If you don't know what they're for, why collect them? But once again, has hafting marks. It's an agricultural tool, and we've since found them all over Australia. This map was based on the work of American archaeologist and Norman Tyndale, and it shows where Aboriginal people were growing grain in Australia. The darker shaded areas of the current Australian wheat belt. So Aboriginal people were harvesting grain on an area 4 times that of Europeans today, and we now know it comes into here as well. So it's a massive area of production, and we've been, our local community, the Yuin community of South Coast New South Wales, far east of Victoria, we've been trialling growing these grains, or actually what we do is we find where they are, the old remnant pastures of Aboriginal people, and we encourage the Australian plants against the exotics, and we've been harvesting them, turn them into flour, and 2 weeks ago we served them to the Governor of Victoria at a dinner for restaurateurs and cooks, and that bread is absolutely sensational. It's a very dark, rye-looking flour, and the beauty of it for a drying continent is that it doesn't need any water apart from what falls out of the sky. It doesn't need any pesticide at all because it's an adapted Australian plant. It doesn't need any fertiliser for the same reason, adapted Australian plant, and it's perennial. So it sequesters carbon. So if we're talking sustainability and we're talking about ecologically friendly plants, then these Australian plants are so important to us. And whenever we talk about peace, we've always got security warnings. Go to the next one, John. When my family and I were trying to grow these plants, we found that restaurateurs and bakers were particularly keen to get hold of the flour to bake the bread, because there's a hipster market for these foods. The bakers want to be the first. They've tried the African grains. That decade has passed. Now they want to try the Aboriginal grains. But the hardest thing of all, it seems, is that making sure that Aboriginal people can benefit from these grains. Because if Aboriginal people aren't part of this burgeoning economy, and it'll be $1 billion economy, because we're not just talking about some trendy foods, we're talking about changing the nature of agriculture in Australia, back to the old agriculture. If we're not determined to make sure that Aboriginal people are part of that, then we will continue in the fashion that we are now, where 96% of all Aboriginal foods sold in Australia are sold by non-Aboriginal people. So at the moment we have 4% of that market of our traditional foods. Thanks to the fact that Dark Emu has been reprinted 23 times, was a Bangarra performance, The kids' version of that will come out next month, and next year it'll be a two-part ABC series. Thanks to this, I've been able to employ 7 or 8 young Aboriginal men and women from Jigamie on the far south coast of New South Wales, and we've been growing our foods. And the reason that I think this is important is because these people will become skilled in those foods, and here is our opportunity for the Australian government, New South Wales government, to make sure that Aboriginal people are part of this industry, because there will be people trained. There will be no excuse not to make sure those people are part of the industry. The only thing holding us back is that Aboriginal people don't have any land. I worked with an organisation which is supposed to assist Aboriginal people onto land, and this is the kangaroo grass that we've been harvesting this year, and the Aboriginal organisation, in which no Aboriginal people are employed, not one, because she resigned in disgust, that whole system failed to deliver land to us. So I was very grateful to my mother because she and I bought a little broken down doll's house on the Great Ocean Road in 1981. It became a valuable property. It wasn't then because the road wasn't made, but it became valuable. I sold that to buy land at Wallagrow River near Malakuta where I live, so that we could grow these grains. And it's proven to be a boon because nobody can tell us what to do. Because often the best thing that government can do when it comes to Aboriginal policy is to get out of the way, because there is so much bureaucracy and incompetence and wasted money that it is often better for government simply to get out of the way, ask Aboriginal people to do it, because we are not incompetent. We do these things, we do them consistently. The hops at Corranderk won prizes at the Melbourne show years and years in a row, and only stopped when local people at Healesville became jealous and asked the government to take the land off Aboriginal people and kick those Aboriginal people off because they were too successful at farming. And why? Because they knew how to do it. The Aboriginal people at Lake Keelambeet, when the Aboriginal protector, the missionary Seabright, bought a plough and started ploughing the land because he thought he was going to have to teach the people about agriculture. They walked onto the land, took the plough off him and began to plough on the contour instead of up and down the slope like he had been doing. Because Aboriginal people knew that they would be able to look after that land, care for that land, love the land, because they were already experienced agriculturalists. And this is the message that we need to get across. These women who harvested this seed with their children at Lake Mungo. This grain is a panicum. That's the bread that I served the governor a fortnight ago. It grows in sand. If we could have the next slide, that's the sand that grass grew in. So, and the bread baking in that solar oven is made from that flour. How important to Australia is a food plant that grows in sand? These are incredibly important things. I'm sorry that I'm running out of time. There is a lot more to say about this, but the important thing is that I want you to remember that Aboriginal people were a people of enormous achievement. There's a midden down at Warrnambool which we thought was 80,000 years old. You know, out of Africa says 75,000 years old. So for 5,000 years, people at Warrnambool were incredibly lost. But now we know that midden is actually 100,000 years old. They are investigating a midden nearby, an old Aboriginal living place, which is going to prove to be 120,000 years old. And that's southern Australia. So if there's been a north-south migration, which I doubt, then there are likely to be older places. But the other important thing is that the grinding stones that have been found in these old sites are upwards of 65,000 years. The Egyptians invented bread made from grain flour 17,000 years ago. So that woman who invented bread at Cuddy Springs 65,000 years ago and Arnhem Land around the same time was an absolute genius of a scientist and an alchemist, because she was combining food with water and heat and experimenting to produce what we now know as bread. And there's a photograph in here of those old Aboriginal breads, which are at Melbourne Museum. They've never been displayed. Why wouldn't you show the oldest food on earth if you had it in your collection? Anyway, we're looking for support so that we can probe that bread, get the chemistry of it, and find out what the grain was, what the cooking method was, and what the yeast was. There is so much science to do. I'm hoping that the young people that I work with around the country, young Aboriginal people, young non-Aboriginal people, I hope together we can learn the story of Australia, because that story is one of peace and prosperity, not war. Thank you.